I guess there is this new adaptation of Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte. I have no idea if this is like a television show or if it's a movie or if it's some kind of like streaming exclusive thing. I actually don't even know if this is like actually out at this point or if it's coming out soon. But I do know that all of the smart people I know are saying that it's going to be really, really bad. So rather than spend a whole video just rage baiting you talking about why the bad thing is bad, I thought it would be probably more interesting for me to talk about the book that inspired the bad thing, and all of the little interesting things in it that I know about as a person who literally gets paid to study Victorian literature. So for those of you who don't know, I am a PhD, and Wuthering Heights was probably one of the texts that I don't want to say I like fixated the most on in my studies or my reading, because it's not my favorite thing I've read in Victorian literature, but I definitely found it to be an object of fascination when I was studying for my exams. And this is like a whole different thing I could get into, but this is basically where they make you read like 150 different texts. Some of them are books, some of them are poems, some of them are like essays. And then you just have to take a test on all of them. A written test, not like a multiple choice thing. And Wuthering Heights was one of the ones that I actually like wrote about on my exams, because obviously you can't literally like address every single one of them. So this is like, I think in my mind, this is like something that I have like read relatively recently. It's still pretty fresh for me. And I've read it twice now. So the first time was like a casual read where I felt it was very difficult. I didn't feel like I got everything out of it that I should. And the more recent one, I just felt like I uncovered so much that I feel compelled to share with you. So this is what this video is going to be. I'm going to start off with giving you some interesting stuff about the author herself, Emily Bronte, because she is a pretty haunting figure, I think. And I feel like when you know about her and who she was, there are just a lot of things that can help you conceptualize interesting things about this book more than you would otherwise. Then I'm going to get into actually interesting things in the book to look out for when you are reading it, because presumably if you're, getting into this now, I mean, I've just heard of a lot of people like getting into reading this for the first time. The third thing I want to talk about is for those people who are reading this book for the first time and might not be as used to reading classics. I want to talk a little bit about like how to read classics and basically how to make it easier on yourself, because hold on, my tea is about to be done. What was I talking about? As somebody who, like, I know I'm a literature PhD now, but I've mentioned this on my channel before, but I literally was like the last person in my first grade class to learn how to read, and I spent many, many years like struggling with classics, including when I was getting my undergraduate degree. So like if you are reading this for the first time and you're like struggling a lot with the language and just struggling to internalize it, you are not alone, and it doesn't mean you're dumb or that you should stop trying. So I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of I almost said the movie. Maybe it'll be, if it's typical of my channel, as long as a movie. Yeah. This video has been kind of inspired by me seeing just on like different like book sharing platforms like Goodreads. I've been seeing like a lot of people, specifically very young people, trying to read Wuthering Heights for the first time because of the adaptation that's coming out, and just struggling with it a lot and like having their experience not be super good, because it is just like kind of, it's a classic, it's more advanced, it's from a different time. So for those people, I wanted to basically create this video so that you can maybe get a little bit more out of it and at least be interested in it. And hopefully, like, if you like the adaptation, hopefully like build on the interest that adaptation created for you, and like dive deeper into it rather than just, feeling like, well, the adaptation's great, but like who gives a fuck about this stinky book. So that's basically what this is going to be. First of all, I also, before I get started with all this, I feel compelled to show you all my copy of Wuthering Heights. This is kind of an eyesore, as are all my tabs from when I was reading for exams. But it's a pretty neat copy. I think I picked this up from some half-price books at some point. Yeah, it's this beautiful copy with these gold pages. It has this portrait of Emily Bronte just on the inside cover. And then throughout it, there are a bunch of, I'm trying to find one. Oh, yeah, a bunch of different woodcut illustrations. So really kind of emulating what like Victorians might have had in their own copy, because just including little illustrations like that was like more of a thing then. Yeah. Another one here. They're pretty expressive, I think. Anyway, yeah, I always think it's funny. I had like a meeting with my advisor one time where we were talking about Wuthering Heights specifically. And I remember like her being like, well, what edition of the book do you have? And I just like, I lifted this up and she was just quiet for a moment. And like, you know, because you're supposed to have like a scholarly edition, not like whatever this is, but they don't pay us. So, you know, we have to take what we can get. Anyway, let's get into, first and foremost, a couple of notes on Emily Bronte. So, she put out Wuthering Heights in 1847. That's when the book was published. I think that one of the first things you should know about Emily Bronte was that she was kind of a weirdo. And not a weirdo as in like, oh, she was like a nice tomboy who just wasn't fitting in at the times. We don't know a lot about her. And frankly, like about the Brontes in general, sometimes it's hard to just like piece things together, but she is kind of known as like the most mysterious Bronte sister. So there's three of them. We have Charlotte Bronte, who did Jane Eyre, Anne Bronte, who did The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and Emily Bronte, who did Wuthering Heights. All three of the sisters died young. All three of them were relatively isolated. So very, very kind of like isolated within their family. Charlotte and Anne were extremely close. Emily also did not have more than 2 friends that we know of her having in her entire life who were outside of her family. So a couple of things about Emily's personality. So this isn't personality, but she was this like kind of tall, often called masculine woman. There is no evidence, according to what we currently know, that she was ever in love. Generally, she was a very stubborn person, and she was quite disliked by, I don't want to say everyone who knew her, but by most people who knew her. I find her such a fascinating character because she had this very like domineering, kind of cold, like very like powerful personality. There was a guy who taught her and her sister Charlotte at Brussels for some time. He made a comment that she should have been a man because of her talent for logic and reasoning. Charlotte, her sister, called her a giant and a baby god in one record that we have. Emily was not this like typical Victorian woman, and frankly, like even today, she would have been seen as very kind of gender nonconforming in her behaviors. There are theories that she may have had anorexia. Some people also presume that she may have had autism. I think it's not super productive to be trying to like diagnose people from the past of things, especially in Emily's case where we don't know that much about her. However, those are theories that people had about her. As far as her family life, she and her sisters, like I mentioned, were very, very isolated in the very small village that they lived in. Their father was known as being relatively cold and distant, but I'll put a giant asterisk on that to say that, like, you can't sum someone up completely in that way, and there are some people who dispute the degree to which he was cold or distant. He did have an Irish accent that he passed to his daughters. And this accent kind of isolated them a little bit in their town that they were living in. So they were pretty isolated amongst themselves, and just in general, like, did not have a lot of friends in the village that they were living in. There are some theories, because like I mentioned, all three of the sisters died young. There are some theories that there was some severely contaminated severe contamination issues with the water supply in this village was contributing to their health just not being good throughout their life. And the life expectancies in this village were just not very good. You can read up more about this, especially if you're interested in like looking at public health from like a historical perspective, but basically problems with the privies overflowing into the water supply and being very close to the water supply. Also problems with a graveyard on a hill nearby where the bodies weren't decomposing properly because it was poorly laid out. And just things from the bodies were leaking into the water supply for this village. So that is another kind of gross, nasty, gloomy thing that potentially was contributing to their health not being very good. I'll talk about, well, actually, I should probably talk about her death first. So like I mentioned, she died young. I actually don't remember what age she died at. I'm gonna guess it was 30. I think it was 30. So she died relatively soon after her sister Anne died. And then Charlotte died shortly after she got pregnant for the first time, I think. Emily declined medical help until it was too late. So she kind of had this long decline and she kept refusing to see doctors. Something along the lines of like, this is not her exact words, but like, she basically was like, kind of like talking about doctors like they were like scam artists or crooks or something, and she didn't want to see them. Eventually, she did say to call for the doctor when things were getting really bad at the end, but by then it was just too late. And at her death, and take this with a grain of salt because I haven't been able to find supplementary like proof of this. I think it just goes back to like old town records, so this piece of information has been passed down. But at her death, it is said that she had grown so thin that her coffin was only 16 inches wide. And the carpenter said it was the smallest he'd ever made. So when you think back to her originally being this like really towering, kind of domineering masculine figure, kind of stomping her big personality all around the place and being stubborn and tall and kind of like cold and imposing in some ways. It's even kind of like sadder to think about her wasting away to being like the smallest she could possibly be. That wasn't because of anorexia, that was because of, I think they hypothesized it was tuberculosis. The last note that I will say on her, which will segue us into Wuthering Heights, is she had a very interesting relationship with Keeper, her dog. So Keeper was like Emily in that he was not nice. He was not a nice dog. He was known for being relatively vicious and for going for people's throats when they did things that he didn't like or when they tried to, keep him from doing things like jumping on the beds. She loved him very much, but he was a violent dog, and she had this understanding of him explicitly as like an animal with different rules than a person. So she was very, very endeared to him, but at the same time, she had this understanding that dogs operate by different rules than people do, or rather are more in touch with a certain savagery that people aren't in touch with. And so she knew she would have to fight him for dominance. So there is record of this problem where Keeper kept like laying on the beds in the house, And one day she simply beat him until he was nearly blind from the swelling that she caused. And after that, he was relatively obedient towards her. I think that this incident is really defining of her character. It's something that my professor kind of told me about as like a really interesting anecdote about her personality. And I do think that you can kind of like draw some parallels between this scene between her and her own dog and some scenes with the dog's skulker in Wuthering Heights. So this is a dog that kind of attacks somebody in the book. Some people draw some parallels between this incident with her and Keeper and a scene that happens with Skulker. And I will let you read the book to actually draw those parallels yourself rather than telling you what to think. I want to also note that as someone who has read a ton of Victorian literature, I find it very interesting how dogs are portrayed in Wuthering Heights. So normally in a lot of the books that I've read, like especially books by women, dogs are often portrayed in this period as being kind of like helpers and like very, very much not just man's best friend, but like woman's best friend specifically. So you get a lot of scenes of like dogs protecting women from abusive men, or dogs being the first to warn a woman about an abusive man. Like dogs are seen as these like judges of human character, and they can see things about people that people can't. In Wuthering Heights, alternatively, dogs are portrayed as kind of more savage and vicious creatures. So even in other texts where I have seen dog attacks portrayed, it's usually like the dog has some kind of intention behind doing it. Wuthering Heights is from what I remember, it's a little bit more ambiguous. I think it's very strange how dogs are so much more vicious in this text, and I think perhaps the reason for that is because Emily Bronte did not personify dogs in the same way that other people did. And again, this goes into that like very kind of like chilly logic reasoning thing that she had going on. She was not like a warm and fuzzy person, right? So I think this is a good maybe segue into talking about the book itself and things that are interesting to look out for. I think the first thing that we should maybe talk about, do we talk about nature first? I think I want to just make a quick note on the Gothic first. And like what the Gothic is versus what it isn't. So Wuthering Heights is really interesting to think about as a Gothic novel. I had a little debate about with my professor about this book because I told her that I thought that Wuthering Heights was like capital T, the Gothic novel. But she told me that apparently there's a lot of debate as to whether Wuthering Heights is like kind of like a bad Gothic novel and like it's not doing the Gothic quite properly. And you know, you can read more about that if you like. Try to look for open access scholarship on that. I don't have anything I can recommend you because Gothic stuff is not really my focus. But in terms of how you guys understand the Gothic in general, what you need to know is that a lot of times when professors are trying to simplify this for you, they will explain it as like the Gothic is about like spooky vibes and spooky scary skeletons and like just like fog and stuff, right? Like the fog machine is turned on. The reason the Gothic is actually called the Gothic is because of Gothic architecture. And when is Gothic architecture from? It's from the medieval period. So in Victorian Britain, there was a fixation on a couple different periods of time in history, but specifically there was this obsession with the medieval period in Britain's history. There were kind of two reasons that Britain was obsessed with the medieval period, right? So the first reason was this kind of like, like response to industrialization and developing technology, where it was literally like the return thing that you see today, where it's like the V instead of the U. Yeah. Like they saw it as like, things were so much simpler and we had chivalry and life was just simple and pastoral and blah, 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 blah. There weren't all these horrible factories and pollution. That was like part one. Part two was a little bit more sinister, right? And this fascination with the medieval period as a period of uncivilization and savagery, and thinking about medieval torture and people being more primitive and stupid and superstitious. Because again, the Victorian period was when science started getting really serious, and when evolution started being talked about. Psychiatry was developed and medicine was getting more sophisticated. There was so much development happening. And you had these kind of two camps. Like, the one was afraid of the developments happening and wanted to go back. The other one was like, thank God we have the civilization we have now. Look how scary it used to be back then. And when we apply this understanding to Wuthering Heights, there's a lot of kind of themes in this book about how easy it is to slip into a more animal state or to slip into a savage state. Cathy has this air of savagery to her and this kind of animalistic thing going on with her personality. So she is kind of emblematic of both those fears of slipping into a more animal state and those longings for slipping into a more animal state. This is a little bit like my biased take on it. Like, this is how I read it. Other scholars find there are problems with how this novel represents the Gothic. You can look into that at your own leisure. The Gothic is not just about spooky, scary stuff. It is about primitivity a little bit, right? And uncovering skeletons in the closet. That's another theme that you see a lot. Especially things like murder, incest, just generally kind of like fucked up stuff. It's kind of about this like repressed, broadly, this like repressed fucked upness that people have within them and within their families and within their fucking Gothic looking houses. So yeah, that is kind of a little bit more on the Gothic that goes beyond just like spooky, scary, the fog machine is turned on. So yeah, that is the Gothic. I think perhaps we can talk a little bit about, let's talk about nature. So I've mentioned again that the Victorian period was kind of preoccupied with this boundary between man and nature. And this kind of like goes back a little bit into the 18th century too. So like when you look at like romantic poetry, so think like Wordsworth, Southey, Coleridge, the early romantics, at least, so those first three I talked about, they often represent like this longing to be at one with nature and to be like in the cycles of nature as like a part of it. The second generation of romantics started being a little bit more like examining friction between man and nature. So you see this in like Shelley. Actually, I don't know how much I've read this in Keats. Because Keats is not somebody I've read a ton about. You can even kind of see this appearing in Frankenstein with Mary Shelley. The other Shelley is Percy Bysshe Shelley. Like that is like increasingly you're seeing this examination of like friction between man and nature as something which is hostile to man, like this enemy that needs to be conquered. So here's an example of like how nature is like described in Wuthering Heights, right? Wuthering Heights is the name of Mr. Heathcliff's dwelling. Wuthering be a significant provincial adjective descriptive of the atmospheric tumult to which its station is exposed in stormy weather. Pure bracing ventilation they must have up there at all times. Indeed, one may guess the power of the north wind blowing over the edge by the excessive slant of a few stunted firs at the end of the house, and by a range of gaunt thorns all stretching their limbs one way, as if craving alms of the sun. Happily the architect had foresight to build it strong. The narrow windows are deeply set in the wall, and the corners defended with large jutting stones. So literally, we are defending the house against the forces of nature, right? Wuthering Heights is this fortress against the hostility of the natural environment. Keep this in mind when we start talking about Cathy and how much she longs to go outside. Even in like the smaller images, this is like present, right? So we have this tumult happening outside. The nature is so harsh that it's even eating itself and like bending the trees down, and even the thorns are like begging for some kind of reprieve from the harshness of the environment, right? And humans increasingly were seen as separate from nature. So the fact that even nature is struggling in this environment says something about how hostile it is to people. Even in the smaller images, you can kind of see this like separation or dichotomy happening between civilization and nature. So, you know, that's my room with the candle in it and the trees swaying before it. So, you know, that's like twin image of like the trees swaying in that really harsh wind outside, and then the room with the candle in it. So the house is this like reprieve from the harshness of nature. So I want to get into Cathy now, and her relationship with nature. There is this one scene where the narrator, he is having a kind of dream, and he dreams of, I think it's like something scratching at the window or someone yelling at the window, and he stretches an arm out to seize the importunate branch, instead of which my fingers closed on the fingers of a little ice-cold hand. And this ice-cold hand is presumably that of Cathy. Literally, he reaches out for the tree branch, and instead he grabs Cathy's hand. So Cathy is not fully separated from nature. Cathy is like, she has this imagery of being like one with nature, and not just one with nature, but one with the savage nature that Wuthering Heights is surrounded with. I also want to point out the myth of Daphne, if you don't know it. So Daphne was turned into a tree to escape rape from Apollo. So Apollo wanted Daphne. Daphne wanted to remain a virgin for her whole life. So she races through the forest with Apollo chasing her, appeals to her father and says, you know, please make it so that I never have to marry him or be with him. Her father basically turns her into a tree, and by the time that Apollo gets to her, she has transformed into a tree. So women transforming into trees, this is like the Daphne image, right? Of women specifically escaping man by transforming into nature and by going back to nature. I'm going to kind of problematicize thinking of this as an entirely feminist image, specifically because at the same time that man was trying to conquer nature, what was going on? Well, women were trying to win more human rights. Now, what happens in the discourse when women are trying to win human rights at the same time men are trying to conquer nature? There was an increasing like association of like, man is with civilization, women are with nature. Like they saw women, a lot of times when you read men's like sexist manifestos from this period, they will describe women as these instinctive thinking or instinctive feeling, intuitive creatures, right? Who are slaves to our nature, which usually meant like slaves to our hormones or the menstrual cycle. And so the association of women with nature was not just this like mystical, oh, they can be free with nature. There was something of like opposition and war in it, right? As men were at war with nature, they kind of used that to kind of bolster their like desires to keep women suppressed and to associate that suppression with their increasing kind of like civilization and industrialization. There are a lot of reasons why industrialization literally made sexism against women worse. I won't get into it right now, but like that is a thing that existed. So this association of Cathy with Daphne, you can kind of read it not purely as this, oh, she's this magical princess who runs in the wild. Like, it's not just that. It's very much like her relationship with Heathcliff. It is an oppositional image. Because anyone who knows anything about the romance in this book knows that it's like love wrapped up in hate, or love that like curdles and becomes this like disgusting kind of hate because it's so strong and it has this just element of obsession and desperation to it. That's a really interesting passage, and I'll talk a little bit more about borders between people and nature in a second here. There is a description of Cathy as a little monkey. So it says, the little monkey had crept by the skylight of one garret along the roof into the skylight of the other, and it was with the utmost difficulty I could coax her out again. So literally, like, she's acting like an animal that you're trying to control. And then there is, I'll start talking here about like Cathy in nature, right? So Cathy, as you can tell by that monkey passage, she is this very animalistic figure in this. And again, I guess with the Daphne, that already shows her associations with nature. But, you know, the description of her as literally like an animal really doubles down on that. And, you know, also think about like a monkey, right? I'm thinking about, I recently read Mary Beard's Laughter in Ancient Rome, and she talks about how the Romans found monkeys funny because they were like close to human, but not quite there. So, thinking about, I don't know, Cathy specifically is pictured as an animal that is like almost human, but not quite. And also, this gets even worse when you think about women being dehumanized in this time, right? And, you know, you could do all kinds of readings of this, right? Of like, you know, was Emily feeding into that idea, or was she criticizing it? Because obviously, our narrator is a man. So, you know, that also further complicates it. So Cathy is like constantly longing to return to nature, right? It's not just in this guy's dream. Here's a quote, and that wind sounding in the firs by the lattice, do let me feel it, it comes straight down the moor, do let me have one breath. So specifically this fixation on the wind. That wind that bends the trees over and totally just beats the house to hell and back. Cathy wants to breathe that in. She isn't intimidated by it like the other people are. I think we're going to go into borders between man and nature really quickly, actually. And then I'm going to go, so I want to talk about windows, and then I will conclude with talking about a little bit more about Cathy and Heathcliff specifically. I think this is what I wrote about in my exam. I wrote about windows in this book. Windows in this book, and as they're represented in another book I won't get into today. But windows, if you think about it, are literally the border between man and nature, right? They are this like in-between space. Like we can look out, nature can look in. It's like the moment you can get close enough to it without actually being in it. So here's one image that I really like. So the snow and wind whirled wildly through the window, even reaching my station and blowing out the light. So in this scene, we can see that the snow and wind, nature intrudes into the domicile and blows out the light that we are using to keep ourselves out of darkness. So if Catherine is affiliated with nature, then the snow coming in through the window is woman's triumph over the domicile and attempts to control her, right? Specifically, her triumph. So it kind of symbolizes that. There are other novels where women, or not novels, I'm thinking of a very long poem called Aurora Leigh. So in Aurora Leigh, she's initially associated with nature, and she has those similar longings to Cathy, but she learns how to become at ease in a more pastoral landscape, specifically in a green bedroom. Catherine is not like that. Catherine wants to be out there, and she's like water in an overflowing cup is how I describe it. So if we add this to the Daphne imagery, Daphne escapes Apollo by becoming a tree, by returning to nature. So it is kind of feeding into that same idea of Cathy wanting this triumph. I mean, the snow coming in through the window and snuffing out the light, this is like the nightmare image of the Victorian patriarch, isn't it? Nature comes in and triumphs over the civilization that you tried to create. And, you know, the woman gets away from Apollo. Daphne escapes him. She becomes a tree. Very, just delicious. Like, ecological readings of this are so fun to do. Here's another one. So, tossing about, she increased her feverish bewilderness to madness and tore the pillow with her teeth, then raising herself up all burning, desired that I would open the window. Again, she's like tearing the pillow with her teeth like an animal. And then she says, "Oh, I'm burning. I wish I were out of doors. I wish I were a girl again, half savage and hardy and free, and laughing at injuries, not maddening under them. Why am I so changed? Why does my blood rush into a hell of a tumult at a few words? I'm sure I should be myself were I once among the heather on those hills. Open the window again wide. Fasten it open. Quick, why don't you move?" Very famous passage, and you can obviously see how this adds to what I'm saying. You know, open the window. Let me go back where I belong. Where I came from, in a sense, right? She wants savage girlhood, not domesticated womanhood. Yeah, last quote about windows. The thing that irks me most is this shattered prison. After all, I'm tired of being enclosed here. I'm wearying to escape into that glorious world and to be always there, not seeing it dimly through tears and yearning for it through the walls of an aching heart, but really with it and in it. For her, the savagery of nature is not something to escape. It's something to embrace. And perhaps the greatest irony of this is that this whole first half of this novel is about Catherine being caged and bending to the whims of society rather than embracing her savage desire for Heathcliff, right? You know, her longing for nature is not just about wanting to be a little girl again, but also not wanting to have to adhere to the Victorian standards of propriety and who she's allowed to be attracted to. You know, she wants to escape into that glorious world and to be always there, not seeing it dimly through tears and yearning for it through the walls of an aching heart. So she specifically conjures the image of the heart here. So I think you could debate to what degree her longing for savagery in nature is related to marriage standards at the time and the fact that she was explicitly successfully caged by them, versus whether it's actually about escaping those standards entirely and just escaping men entirely. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about Cathy and love and hate. So this is an interesting line here. So she says, "I wish I could hold you till we were both dead. I shouldn't care what you suffered. I care nothing for your sufferings. Why shouldn't you suffer? I do." So one thing I find really interesting about this quote, and again, like this feeds into like what we know about Emily Bronte's personality. Don't think she's equivalent to Cathy, because she's not. But the fact that she even could think to like have a character express these feelings, I think is like because she had the personality that she had, this harshness to her. I think this quote is especially interesting, and again, maybe feeding into Emily Bronte having more of like a, I don't know, like a masculine personality, because normally it is male characters who make these comments about, I wish we were both dead, in like the love pair. So I'm thinking about one of the like abusive guys in George Gissing's The Odd Women, from the same time period. He makes comments about wanting to kill them both. Thinking also about Florence Marryat's Nelly Brooke. This is an out-of-print novel, so I don't expect anybody watching this to know it, but I'm studying it extensively. And there is a interesting brother-sister duo in that novel, and he makes comments too about, sometimes I wish I could just fucking kill you, and then kill myself. And so normally this is like male characters who are making comments like this, and you know, usually they talk about like guns being used to kill people. Cathy wishes, I wish I could hold you till we were both dead. It's almost this image of suffocation. And when you think about what she's dealing with, being inside and specifically longing to breathe in the wind, well, you can think yourself about what all this means, right? So he says, I could almost see her, and yet I could not. I ought to have sweat blood then from the anguish of my yearning, from the fervor of my supplications to have but one glimpse. I had not one. She showed herself, as she often was in life, a devil to me. And since then, sometimes more and sometimes less, I've been the sport of that intolerable torture, infernal. And then there also is this comment from Cathy, a perfect misanthropous heaven, and Mr. Heathcliff and I are such a suitable pair to divide the desolation between us. So, you know, Cathy describes herself and Heathcliff. She describes herself and Heathcliff as misanthropes, so people who hate other people, but yet who desire the company of other misanthropes, who they still hate. So, you know, I think a lot when I'm doing my research of like love and hate between women and how love and hate plays into attraction. Like, even if you guys think about the current place we are now in our society, which by the way is really not that far off from the Victorian period. Like, it's crazy because I will read sexist rants from the Victorian period and I'm like, they are still talking about this on podcasts today. So this is, you know, time is a flat circle. 200 years is like not a long time at all in the grand scheme of things. We are still grappling with the cultural ramifications of the things that happened in the Victorian period, right? You know, even if you think about how like men and women conceptualize attraction to each other today, right? Anyone who has ever been in a heterosexual relationship knows that there are just certain tensions that are there, frankly, because of misogyny. Misogyny and the ways that men and women are socialized to be like different from each other in certain ways. Naturally, this causes conflict between us. I mean, think about how many men are attracted to women, but they express that attraction through hatred. Like, I'm thinking about like pornography and men, you know, being attracted to women, but wanting to see women choked or crying, and even doing those things to their girlfriends, right? You know, men who want nothing more than to have a girlfriend and fucking hating every single woman in the universe, right? And, you know, women have this too on a different scale and in different ways, right? Like, you know, women saying that they think all men are like fucking disgusting, and yet wanting nothing more than to have a boyfriend or be loved. So, you know, I think Victorian literature is especially interesting in how it represents love and hate in male-female attraction. I think that Wuthering Heights is specifically good, even if we take gender out of the picture, well, you can't really take gender out of the picture, actually, because of all the commentary this is making on, like, men trying to conquer women and the expectations placed on women and how they fucking ruin everything. You know, even going beyond that, if you think about what this really is, it's how love can turn into complete fucking obsession and how, like, love, when it doesn't work out, can turn into just the deepest, darkest type of hatred, which at the same time is like a hatred that is like not at odds completely with that love. I will say also one more thing. I think cruelty generally is kind of oddly unmoralized in this novel. It very often goes unremarked upon. So if you read something like Charles Dickens, he'll say a lot about cruelty. Weirdly, I don't want to say it's amoral, but I do think that in many ways, the kind of unique, like, chilliness to Emily Bronte's personality, I think that really comes through in this. And I think that's part of why I think, like, so many people talk about just hating Wuthering Heights when they read it. And you're entitled to not like the writing style. I do think it is, it's singular as a piece of literature. I just, like, I don't know that there are many things I could successfully, like, compare to this from the Victorian period. And that's why I think it's just a work of genius. I do, because who could she have been imitating? You know, I mean, and that's the little god at work, right? Yeah, I do think this is glorious for that reason. I don't think that there is any other heroine who is quite like Cathy also. And I read a lot of women's fiction. Like, I've read quite a few Victorian novels. I'd be interested to see if anyone has, like, a good comparison to Cathy or even to Wuthering Heights. Because I am hard-pressed to really think of one, specifically from this same period. I mean, maybe we can go back and trace it back to, you know, certain things from way earlier. I don't know. But I just don't think, I think one of the most interesting things about this is how isolated it is and how singular it is. Yeah, that is probably going to be my last comment on the actual content of this book and what you should look out for when you are reading it. The final thing that I want to talk about is a few words for people who are not particularly used to reading classics. Maybe you are just reading this because you liked the adaptation and you think it's interesting. So I think this is what I'm going to say. So I've said that I was like, you know, like I'm an English PhD now. I was the last person in my first grade class to learn how to read. And frankly, for many, many years, I need you to know, I forced myself to read because of the vibe. Like, there were so many things that I was reading for my undergraduate degree where, like, I was struggling to make it through, and I had to spend a lot of time reading things and reading classics before I could start really feeling, like, comfortable with them. And there are still plenty of books where when I'm reading it, I have to slow down to really understand it. So the first thing that I will say is that reading is a skill. So if you are a person who is normally reading things that just are, like, frankly, like, on a lower reading level, if you read this and you find yourself struggling with this, that doesn't mean you are not the, like, type of person to read classics. Classics are the type of thing where it's like you have to, if you think about, like, weightlifting, right? To get better at weightlifting, you have to try and do a little bit more than you actually think you can do before you get better. You have to struggle through it a little bit instead of only ever lifting things that feel comfortable. Reading is the same way. So, you know, because I was, like, forcing myself for so long to read things that I thought were challenging and that were hard for me, and sometimes very frustrating, that is how I got to the current reading level that I'm at. So, if you're initially struggling with this, do not feel like that means you will never be able to just sit down and read it in, like, a cozy, vibey way where you don't have to do, like, that extra sweating basically when you're doing it. The other thing that I will say is with classics, it often takes more than one read to really feel like you're having a good time. So, and sometimes even more than 2 reads. So your first read is never supposed to be the most fun read of a classic. So, just keep that in mind. Like, it is not abnormal at all to be reading a classic for the first time and be just kind of like struggling with it a little bit. That is very normal. I feel like we live in this era of like people being giant posers and like pretending like they're perfect at something from the very first moment they try it. If you're reading a classic for the first time and it's hard for you, that's basically normal. The other thing I will say, rather than referring to GPT or AIs for extra help, what I was taught to do when I was an undergrad and like doing my English major is instead of doing that before each chapter, go ahead, if you're like really struggling with the language and stuff and it's just you want it to be a little bit easier and get a little bit more out of it on your first read, what you can do is before each chapter, read specifically the Spark Notes summary of what happens in that chapter and then read the chapter. And what this does is it basically makes it so you have the basic plot down and you know what to expect, and it makes it easier for you to kind of learn how they talk back then, rather than just like struggling through and like being like, okay, I think I got the plot details down. That is usually, like, I still use that technique today when I need to read a classic more quickly than I would be able to otherwise, and if it's something unfamiliar to me. Yeah, that is the other thing that I recommend to kind of make things a little bit easier. Don't just give up. The reason these things are called classics is because they have basically infinite reread value. At different times of your life, you can literally take different things out of it. There is really nothing like having a lifelong relationship with a book where you have this almost spiritual connection to it and it keeps connecting you to your own life in different ways and giving you insights about your own life and helping you to make sense of the world. Like, the reason that classics are seen as high art is because they enable us to do that. There's a really good article by Donna Tartt that I read a long time ago where she talks about like the difference between art and entertainment. And she says that, true art has a pulse and it breathes. And so that is what you have to gain by engaging with classics, right? And it's like great if things like the new adaptation are your bridge to classics. Because I know that like when I started out, I too appreciated having some kind of a bridge. Yeah, you have a lot to gain by actually engaging with the novel itself. I hope this was interesting for you. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments below, and I will do my best to get to all of those. I don't think I misspoke at all in this, but if I made a mistake, please do correct me. Lots of talking. That's all I have for you today. Bye.